I'm Maryanne Garry. I'm a professor here at the University of Waikato in psychology and to the New Zealand Institute for Security and Crime Science. And today, I'm delighted to sit down again with Professor Lisa Feldman Barrett to talk about her new book and a lot more. Professor Barrett is a psychological scientist, a neuroscientist, one of the world's most respected scientists in the field of human emotion. Her research has radically changed the prevailing wisdom about how the human brain and the body work together to create emotions. She shows that our emotions are not built into our brains from birth, nor are they triggered by outside forces. Instead, they're events that our brains construct. They're shaped by our experiences, our language, and our culture. Professor Barrett is a University Distinguished Professor of Psychology at Northeastern University, and she has appointments at Harvard Medical School and Massachusetts General Hospital. Her work in cognitive, social, and affective neuroscience has significant implications for both everyday and high-stakes interactions. Her books and her more than 200 peer-reviewed scientific papers show the impact of her research on a range of fields. She's also the immediate past president of the Association for Psychological Scientists, which is a global organization of more than 30,000 members. She's unsurprisingly won a fistful of awards, and by any respected measure of impact, Professor Barrett consistently is in the top 1% of scientists around the world. In March, Professor Barrett came to New Zealand as part of the New Zealand Writers' Festival to talk about her book, How Emotions Are Made, The Secret Life of the Brain. The University of Waikato is a proud sponsor of the festival. During her stay here at the university, Professor Barrett delivered a sold-out public lecture and received an honorary doctorate. This is the university's most prestigious honor, and it recognized her substantial contribution to the field of psychological science and her pioneering approach to human emotion. And now, Professor Barrett has a new book, 7.5 Lessons About the Brain, a collection of short essays that Amazon has described as one of the best books of 2020. They named it an editor's pick, and they announced it in a spectacular billboard in New York City's Times Square. But when it comes to praise for Professor Barrett's new book, don't just take Amazon's word for it. You can take Leonard Mlodinow's 7.5 Lessons About the Brain reads like a novel, he says, one whose main character is all of us. Read this book. It will make you smarter about yourself and your species. Or take the Kirkus Reviews, which acclaim the book as an excellent education in brain science. Or my favorite review from Stanford neuroscientist David Eagleman, who described the book this way: beautiful writing and sublime insights that will blow your mind like a string of firecrackers. If you want a rundown of the brain and its magic, start here. You can find Professor Barrett's book in all the usual places, including online from one of my favorite shops, Unity Books in Wellington. In the meantime, we hope you enjoyed this conversation with Professor Lisa Feldman Barrett, in which we talk about her new book, The State of the World, and answer some of your questions. 7.5 Lessons About the Brain. Here's my first question, Lisa Barrett.
Okay.
The half. Do you have a fear of commitment?
No, but I have a definite desire to be different.
Okay.
And unique. And also I occasionally aspire to funny, although that's hard in my house because my daughter and my husband are both like really, really, really funny people. So I usually come in third.
Oh, you're funny.
Well, often not on purpose. I mean, I try, but anyways, I thought 7.5 Lessons was a cute title, but also I'm not really telling the whole story of brain evolution. I'm only telling a little snippet. It does feel like a half lesson. And so I think it's truth in advertising.
Oh, that's great. Do you have a favorite lesson out of the 7.5?
Yeah, well, I have favorites for different things. I think the half lesson is my favorite in the sense of I think it's just incredibly cool. I think brain evolution is incredibly cool. I think the question of like, why do we even have a brain is incredibly cool. And the whole evolutionary story, only part of which I tell in this lesson, is really unexpected. And so that's fun. I like things that are unexpected and things that challenge my own beliefs. I like the seventh lesson because I think, which is the seventh lesson is about civilization. So how do we create reality? How do our brains in concert with one another and our bodies, create reality? I like that lesson because I think there are moments where you can connect what's written to the current moment. And also, although the book was written, obviously completed before the pandemic started or before the presidential election in the United States. And I also like it because there are places where I'm being a little snarky, but then
No.
but then very quickly I'm really inviting people to think deeply about some things. And that contrast is fun, I think. And I would say I like lesson 3, which is about little brains, how little brains wire themselves to become adult brains. That lesson I like because it's one place where I felt I broadcast for people that I take off my lab coat, and I try really hard in each lesson not to tell people what to think, but to invite them to think. But in that lesson, I come pretty close to telling people what to think, having to do with childhood poverty and the effect on the brain. And I feel really passionate about that. And I feel like the science is really on my side, and politics really gets in the way of doing what's right. And so I feel very strongly about that. So that was an opportunity for me to, express, like, responsibly express my views based on the science as I understand it.
How would this book have been different if you had written it even 5 years ago? Would there be fewer lessons, or would there be different lessons?
That's so interesting that you asked me that, because, about, I guess, almost 15 years ago now, I was going to write a book called 6 Facts About the Brain. And I realize I'm using the F word, fact, which scientists don't like. We don't like that F word because, everything is probabilistic and contextual and so on. But I really had this idea of writing 6 facts about the brain. And if you look at those facts, and I decided not to write it really because I was awarded an NIH Director's Pioneer Award right when I was starting to write the book. I had just started a sabbatical, and I was just starting to write the book, and then I was given this award. Very lucky to receive this award, but it meant that was the end of my sabbatical and the end of my book. And so if you look back, though, I would say that that not every single one of the essays is exactly the same, but there's a family resemblance.
Huh.
Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I love that. I'm just looking on your website about some of these quotes, and I really like this one: 7.5 lessons about the brain, reads like a novel, one whose main character is all of us. That's really nice. And it will make you smarter about yourself and your species. So any idea how will this book make me smarter, Lisa, about myself? I would like to be smarter about myself.
Well, first of all, I think that, sorry, I've got something in my throat. First of all, I think that I need a glass of water because I have something in my throat.
All right.
Okay. First of all, I think that I really think that science and philosophy are tools for living. And I don't necessarily mean that in a self-helpy kind of way. I mean that that really the best science and the best philosophy, and maybe this even applies to, to history and anthropology too, really have little nuggets of knowledge that you can use to think about who you are. Like, what kind of a human are you? What kind of a human do you want to be? And what kind of choices do you have? How much responsibility do you have for yourself and for other people? And I think these are big perennial questions. Then, and all of us need a little bit of nudge to think about them so that we don't wake up and we're 70 and wondered what we did with our lives. So what I tried to do here was write a series of essays that were entertaining, that would offer people little nuggets of neuroscience that they could take to a dinner party. Because, you know, when I was writing this, I was assuming we were all still having dinner parties. Take to a dinner party, entertain your friends, have a little bit of fun, but also have the lessons linger, and where you would continue to think about them. So even though each one only takes, you know, half an hour or something to read, they're little essays about very, very big ideas, and they're written in a way to sort of invite you to think and to keep thinking, to kind of linger on these ideas for a little while after you read them. And so far, the kinds of reviews the book is getting and the comments I'm getting from people indicate that it was largely successful. I mean, there are a lot of people reading the book who would never pick up a science book ever. You know, that's just not their interest. And that's partly what I was going for. I mean, in a way, I wrote it as a kind of, you know, choose your own adventure, right? You can just read the essays and that's fine and get something out of it. If you want a little more of a traditional popular science experience, you can read the appendix. And if you really want to dive deep on scientific references from peer-reviewed journals or other books, you know, there's a whole website full of web notes, full of references. So people can dive into the science as little or as much as they want, but it shows everybody how much fun science is, I hope. So I don't think you need that lesson, but I think for some people that's probably a bit of an epiphany. And I think it will maybe lead you to think a little bit about questions about human nature and your human nature that, you know, maybe you haven't thought about for a while.
Yeah, that's cool. I'm going to ask you some questions that people have sent in, and hopefully we have enough time to get through all of them and can go off tangents if we wish. So here's one. It's about the state of big technology companies taking advantage of social media, altering our habits. Can you talk about the implications of, you know, maybe put that in a context that has to do with what you do, shaping our emotions and behavior, and comment on that and maybe what you would like to see them do in response, if anything?
Well, in order to answer this question, I have to take a few steps back and fill in some details that we'll need for me to answer the question in a way that would make sense.
Right.
The first thing that I would say is that, you know, we, in neuroscience and really in popular culture, we for a long time believed that, and some people still believe that, brains evolved, you know, in an upward progression towards the human brain, which is the most rational brain of all, and that rationality is really the pinnacle of evolution. And what we can learn from brain evolution is that that's not actually what happened at all. And the main hypothesis now, based on a tremendous amount of evolutionary and developmental neuroscience, is that brains, you can't really say what a brain evolved for, but you can say one of the brain's most important job is to run your body, to run the systems of your body in a metabolically efficient way. That doesn't mean that everything is reduced to metabolism, but it does mean that metabolism is a hidden factor in everything psychological that you do. Everything that's psychologically meaningful to you, metabolism is a hidden factor. And your brain, so the technical word for what your brain is doing is allostasis, which is predictive regulation of your body. Your brain in every moment is attempting to anticipate the needs of your body and meet those needs before they arise. And you might wonder, what does this have to do with social media or technology companies? And I'm going to get there because I actually think the link is important for people to understand. So when I'm talking to the public, I explain allostasis, which is a mouthful, as by a metaphor called body budgeting. So you can think about your brain as running a budget for your body. And it's not budgeting, money. It's budgeting salt and glucose and water and oxygen and all the resources that your body needs to stay alive, so that you can do the most important job that you have from evolution's perspective, which is to pass your genes on to the next generation and have that offspring survive to reproduce themselves. So your brain is running a budget for your body. And you can think about deposits like sleeping and eating healthfully and drinking water and so on. You can think about spending, like exercise is an investment, right? Where you expect to get a return on that investment. It's a big expenditure, but you expect to get a return. And in general, the biggest expenditures you have are moving your body and learning something new. So those are like those are the real expensive items. I like to tell my husband, like when there's a really beautiful pair of shoes or a gorgeous jacket that I really want, and he's like looking at me like at the price, I'm like, the most expensive thing that I can do is learn something new, So this jacket doesn't even come close to that expense. So that's my pathetic attempt at a joke. Anyways, what does this have to do with social media? Well, it turns out that, things that are very predictable to you, things that you expect, that you easily understand, information that you're familiar with or that you've seen before or that you can easily predict is not very expensive for you to process. And information which is unexpected, novel, unusual is very expensive for you to process. Okay. So the situation we have with social media is the following. We have, or technology companies, we have technology companies that are basically using machine learning algorithms serving us material that is similar to or consistent with what we've already consumed. So terrific movie, documentary on this, the Social Dilemma on Netflix, really fantastic depiction of this. And it's comfortable for people because it's familiar and it's similar to what they already believe or stuff they've already consumed. And it's not very metabolically costly. And, right now, maybe not even right now, but for a while now, the cultural context in which we live is pretty expensive from a body budgeting kind of standpoint. So if I had to architect a cultural context that would bankrupt a human body budget and throw people into depression or, opioid addiction or any number of metabolic illnesses, it would be the one that we live in. Not all of us, but many of us, in modern Western civilization, don't sleep enough, don't eat very healthily, often don't exercise enough, might live in a food desert, might have real issues with economics, how much they earn, or economic distress, concerns about being able to feed their kids or take care of their kids, like real serious demands on the body budget, lots of withdrawals, not a lot of deposits. Add to that, a culture of like casual brutality and how people speak to each other, and the political situation in a lot of countries with nationalism rising or not. I mean, for some people, the rise in nationalism is not troubling, but for a lot of people it is. Anyways, add all of these things together, and what you have are people who are really, really encumbered metabolically, but they don't experience it as a metabolic encumberment. They just feel like shit. They feel like shit, basically. And do I think this is the only reason that depression is on the rise and opioid dependence is on the rise and so on? No, it's not the only reason, but I do think that it is partially a reason. It is one of the, we have to stop thinking about these things in like simple linear terms, like there's one cause for any phenomenon. There are usually multiple, weak nonlinear causes that, synergistically produce an outcome, like, a tsunami of depression, that is sweeping many, many countries and many, many young people along with it. So this is the environment in which technology companies are serving you information that keeps you in a silo, or that sort of builds a silo for you. And the truth is, all you have to do is click one button to get out of that silo. If you're a conservative, you can just click one button and get to the New York Times front page, or any other newspaper. Most newspapers, you can at least get to their front page. If you're a liberal in the United States, all you have to do, you can't click on the Wall Street Journal because they're behind a paywall, but you can click on Fox News. So, how much effort does one click take? On the one hand, you might say not a lot of effort. But on the other hand, we are asking people to, when I say this, what I'm asking people to do is to make an expenditure to expose themselves to something that is new and novel and unpredictable and probably that they don't like.
Yeah, it's not the click, it's what you do when you get there, right?
Exactly. So it is kind of, but so what I would suggest is that it is kind of like exercise, that it's a metabolic expenditure, but it's a metabolic expenditure that will pay dividends later. And so it's an investment. So just like exercise, it feels like shit when you're doing it, but the payoff is going to be, it's going to be good later. You're going to be glad that you did it later, even though right now you're really not happy that you're doing it. I think it's kind of the same. And I think what technology companies should do is make that easier for people. I think that everybody has to stop saying, this is not my responsibility, I don't have to care about this. I think we should be making it easier for people who disagree with each other or who hold really, really different views to talk to each other in beneficial ways, which doesn't necessarily mean that they're happy or that their minds are changed, but it does mean that they listen to each other and that they try to connect with each other around their humanity. Because, nationalism isn't rising for no reason at all. There are a bunch of people who, for all the people who were made miserable by nationalism, there are a bunch of people who were made so miserable that they felt nationalism was their only option. And so I think, I guess what I think is that that technology companies can do a lot. In fact, the entertainment industry, I mean, like a lot of the sort of big cultural institutions that we have, some of which are in industry and some of which are in the media and entertainment, can do a lot, actually, can have a huge influence on not just what you might think of as a civics issue, but it's also a public health issue that is really maybe not global, but it's certainly sweeping large parts of the Western world, I would say.
I was just thinking, like, for a place like Fox, to encourage people to like kind of scaffold them into, I don't know, watching a bit of, here's what Rachel Maddow said last night. They would have to do something to get some economic incentive to do that, right? Like, because otherwise they're sending their audience away. Isn't that right, what they would say? Yeah.
Sure. So, I mean, I think, you have to, I guess what I would say, and maybe this is just, me being like, a pie in the sky intellectual, but I don't know how it is everywhere in the world, but in the United States, industries are more interested in entertainment than they are in education. And they confuse entertainment and news. I'm certainly not the first person to make that point, but sometimes, I mean, I'm a huge fan, let's say, of like superhero movies, and my family will all watch superhero movie, and then the amazing like special effects, right? Like Black Panther, love that movie. The special effects comes up and they're like 1,000 people, not a joke, like 1,000 people working on special effects. And I think to myself, what if those 1,000 people who are probably all really brilliant, like computer geniuses working on special effects, what if they were trying to cure cancer? Or what if they were trying to send the first, mission to Mars? Or what if they were trying to just like, there's so many things that are so interesting about the natural world, and so many, eventually achievable things that we can do to make people's lives better. Cure, like get rid of childhood poverty around the world, just like a lot of things that could be done.
Yeah.
If we only put our minds to it. And so, yeah, I mean, like right now, I think, for example, what could technology companies be doing? What could the music industry be doing? What could the media be doing? What could Hollywood be doing, and all of the, movie industries around the world? I don't know. How about social influence to get people to take vaccines and wear masks? Like, what about using network science, what we know, like this beautiful work by Betsy Pollock showing that, when you want to reduce bullying in a school, you don't educate everybody in the school. You just go find the popular kids and you educate them, and then it just percolates out to everybody. It's like really consistent with lesson 7. But it's really consistent with evolutionary anthropology, work in evolutionary anthropology, that we learn from one another, and there are a lot of animals who are social learners, but we are really like souped up social learners, and we tend to learn faster and better from people who have prestige or power or influence. And so, companies could all get together and find, I mean, we have around the world brilliant marketers who try to sell us all kinds of shit we don't need. What about putting them on the case and trying to get like a bunch of influencers in every domain of influence to try to get people to take the vaccines? Because like, you can spend billions of dollars making a vaccine, but then you have to get people to take it, and you have to get people to take it in huge numbers in order to be effective. That might not be an issue everywhere in the world, and it might not be an issue in New Zealand, but I can tell you it is certainly an issue in the United States. And so
the shoe people.
Yeah.
The shoe people. Yeah. It makes me think a number of these questions are talking about some other things from a different point of view. So on your website, lisafeldmanbarrett.com, you have an essay called "Every Pandemic Tells a Story," in which you write about the villains involved in COVID and the pandemic. And you say, of course, scientists, for example, are not the villain. And I'm wondering, how did scientists become the villain? And
scientists are always the villain, or they're idiots. I mean, like, look at how scientists are portrayed in movies. They're either evil or stupid. I mean,
right. Okay. Yeah.
I mean, science, I don't know. I mean, maybe
depressing.
Yeah, it's really depressing. So maybe, I mean, why aren't scientists on the cover of Vogue? Why aren't scientists on the cover of, People magazine? Like, I always thought that somebody should do like a 10 o'clock drama. So I don't know how it is in New Zealand, but in the States and in Canada, the two countries I've lived in, there are always these 10 o'clock dramas. This is where the cop shows and the lawyer shows and whatever. And they're always doctor shows, and they're always filled with like money and sex and intrigue. And, and I'm thinking, you know, academia, okay, money is not always there, but there are grant dollars, and people are, I mean, it's really a lot about ideas and discoveries, and there is illicit sex, and there are all these like really like there's always like that evil person, and like a person who's really striving hard, just like really wants to do the right thing, and like there are all these really interesting characters that you could portray, and you could make science a really cool, sexy thing to do, like as much as being a banker. Because in the end, if you go into finance and you make a lot of money, in the end, all money becomes to you is a way of keeping score. Academics also have a way of keeping score. We call them publications. I suppose that's a really cynical thing to say, but
Oh, it's not as cynical as what I was thinking.
But I guess my point is that science is fun, science is interesting, science is often incredibly frustrating. But the way that science is usually portrayed, not necessarily in novels, but in the movies and on television and so on, is usually, scientists are evil, or they're incredibly stupid. Like they're just, total. They're not even the smart kind of geek. They're just like a total doofus. And I wrote that piece. That piece appears on my blog on my website because I couldn't get a newspaper to take it as an op-ed.
That's sad.
Well, it is what it is.
Yeah.
I had something to say, and I really wanted to say it. So,
yeah.
So it's there for anybody to read. It's really about the stories that we tell ourselves, and how those stories can sometimes be helpful and sometimes not so helpful. And sometimes we can try to tell a different story, in order to change the course of events.
So would you draw a line from what you were saying earlier and what you've just said now about, people are really just heavily taxed on a number of different dimensions, into how we get to this outrage over mask wearing, or first you say don't wear a mask, now you say wear a mask, or people thinking the election is rigged, or it seems like there's this whole, some people call it outrage culture, or is it just easier, or is that all you have left, is to have that kind of reaction rather than to sit back and have the process the harder stuff?
I feel like any way that I answer this question can sound trite and sort of commonsensical. So I'm going to answer it in a bit of a different way and say the following. I could not fathom why somebody would choose not to wear a mask. I just could not fathom why someone would choose to put other people in harm's way in that way. I think part of the reason is that the messaging was bad. People do not understand their own biological residue. Even very sophisticated people who you would imagine to be sophisticated about such things, like physicians, for example, you would expect that they don't have to be virologists. You would imagine that just your average physician, and some are, but some are not, right? Some of them, wear their masks down here. It's like, that's wishful thinking, So that's part of it. And part of it may be, like, why should I make myself uncomfortable for other people who I don't even know, But I think there's something deeper going on, actually. And so I really put myself to a challenge, and I decided that, I was going to sort of like drink my own Kool-Aid. And I decided that I wanted to try to, try to see the world from the perspective of somebody who doesn't want to wear a mask, or who feels like their rights are being infringed on. And when in fact, being asked to wear a mask is, I guess you can see it as infringing on your rights, but not wearing a mask, in my view, is infringing on the potential life actually of other people. And so I tried to put those, arguments aside, and I try, and at the same time I was listening to a book by Robert Reich called The System. So he's an economist, who was in the the first Obama administration, I think, right? And I think that's right. Was he? I think he was.
Or Clinton, something.
Maybe
He was
Clinton.
Treasury Secretary.
Yeah, man, that's right. Yeah, you would know. I'm not American by birth, so I was. Who knows? Anyways, he was a Democrat. He was in a Democratic administration, but the book really takes to task both Republicans and Democrats, actually, in the United States, for setting up what he calls an oligarchy. That there are a handful of incredibly wealthy people who enrich themselves at the expense of the working person, and in order to keep power. And there was, several passages I found really compelling, but one was that before the 1980s, the average CEO made 20 times what his, and I use that adjective very clearly, his employees typically made. And his job was to be a steward of the community and of the people, for the people who worked for his company, his corporation. Now, CEOs make on average 300 times what their employees make. And they no longer see themselves as the stewards of anybody other than their own wealth. And whatever gestures they make towards charity or philanthropy are really just gestures relative to the mountains and mountains and mountains of money that they are essentially stealing from the productivity of their workers. And I just, so I just try to imagine, I'm a person, let's imagine myself, I'm a person who, I actually come from a working poor family. I worked 2 jobs to put myself through school. And so I'm imagining that I'm living paycheck to paycheck. My wages haven't gone up in 20 years. I can't give my kids the things I want to give them. I worry about my ability to send them to college. Or even just to get them new shoes for the next school year, or a new computer or whatever, right? If when my daughter, during COVID, her computer broke, and we bought her a new computer. But there are millions of people who can't do that. Mm. And it's a really serious thing during COVID, because if you don't have a computer, you can't go to school. You can't, because you're using your computer for school, assuming you even have a computer to begin with. Mm. So I'm thinking to myself, imagine that you are living like this. And maybe even imagine that your body budget is encumbered for other reasons. It's not just that you're stressed over, which means, metabolically, encumbered over, economic things. Let's say there are other things too, like maybe, you believe that abortion is evil. Personally, I'm a supporter of a woman's choice to do over her own body. But imagine for a minute if you weren't. Imagine if you really believed, really believed that life began at conception. You would have experienced the last couple of decades in the United States as a genocide. Now you can say, you can sort of argue with that if you're on the other side of that debate, but that's not the goal of this exercise. The goal of this exercise is to try to put yourself in somebody else's shoes, not so that you can argue with them in your head, but so that you can really try to understand what could bring them to the point where they would think that voting for Trump is a good thing, or believing his stories about COVID is okay, or believing that it's okay to, throw democracy in the toilet because it really hasn't done that much for you to begin with. I mean, or even just take a stand over something that seems like really small, but maybe not small to you. Because if your life is already filled with a bunch of with discomfort after discomfort after discomfort, maybe one more discomfort is just the breaking point. I mean, we've all had moments where we feel not one more thing. I cannot take just one more thing. So again, I would say it's not that when you go through an exercise like this, or when I go through this kind of exercise, it's not like I'm letting those people off the hook or saying that I now think it's okay that they're not wearing masks, because that's not true. But I'm trying to really understand how somebody could get to a point where they would do something that to me seems so inexplicably wrong.
Yeah.
And,
And it's like, it's the same kind of thing we talked about at the beginning, which is like, why don't you just click away from Fox News? It takes a lot of effort to try and understand a different way of thinking. And if you just don't have that in your budget, if you haven't budgeted for that, it's really hard.
It is, but you can do, look, I mean, I used to say that I'm not a fan of exercise. I think what I would say now is, after putting in 30 years on a day-to-day basis, I'm probably more of a fan in the sense, not in the sense that I enjoy it when I'm doing it, because I don't. Unless I've lifted a really heavy weight for some reason and not thrown my back out and it's like a big accomplishment, I might feel happy for a minute. But in general, I dread doing it. I don't like it while I'm doing it, but I feel a lot better after I've done it. And I do it every day. And it's in my schedule. It's just something I do. It's one of the things I do that I think of as an investment in brain health, frankly.
Mm-hmm.
And exposing yourself to views and news that you don't like and that you might even find offensive is also an investment. You can see it in exactly the same way. Sometimes it just allows you to have empathy, and dissolving that anger is actually as good for you as it is for other people. From a contemplative standpoint, anger is considered a form of ignorance. Like if you can be angry, then you really don't understand, what the other side of that argument is. Sometimes, investing in some perspective taking helps you hone your own arguments better. Sometimes it actually helps you just connect with somebody on a human basis, and you can just feel good about the fact that you treated somebody with human dignity, even if you completely disagree with them. There are lots of ways that you can find meaning in it, but in my view, it's something akin to exercise. It's a way of keeping your brain healthy.
Right. Okay. So, a question that I think is from one of my colleagues is about, what are your thoughts on the relationship between constructed emotions, your view of constructed emotions, and how we see ourselves as authentic, particularly against the backdrop of society's expectations?
Well, there are so many ways to answer that question. I guess the first thing I would say is that the traditional kind of classical view of emotion, where emotions come pre-wired into your brain at birth, and that your brain is kind of like a battleground between emotion and rationality for control of your behavior. In that view, which is wrong, by the way, there's really no evidence for it at all. But in that view, emotions were seen as evidence of authentic self. That this was really what you experienced, really what you believed. And And actually, you know, in the court of law in the United States, actually in Western courts of law, usually you were considered less responsible for unfortunate actions, for the harm that you would cause, um, because you were less in control of yourself, and you had less free will when you were under the influence of emotion. You know, there's so much to say about that. Some of which I said in my first book, you know, how emotions are made. There's a whole chapter on emotion in the law, for example. But I guess what I would say is this, that when you are born, you are not born with an adult brain. A baby's brain is not a miniature adult brain. It's a brain that is waiting for wiring instructions from the world. And the baby's brain wires itself to the world that is cultivated for that infant and that child, both the physical world and the social world. So what a baby's brain is doing, and a child's brain, all really up to, well, continually actually, because our brains continue, even though they don't continue to develop, you know, at that same speed. We have plasticity throughout our lives. We can acculturate to new environments. We're learning things all the time, using exactly the same neural mechanisms as we use in infancy. But basically, your brain is bootstrapped into itself a model of your own body in the world that you, or in the niche, the parts of the world that are important to your well-being. And your brain uses past experience to reassemble what we would call, you know, an internal model of the world. It's constantly reassembling the past as a way of creating the immediate future, which becomes your present. And it's very, very, very automatic much of the time, meaning you're not thinking about it, you're not doing it deliberately. That's just the way the brain is working. It's just constantly constructing, constantly reassembling the past for the purpose of controlling and controlling your actions and constructing your experience in the present. And so, you know, what's authentic really is that you know, your brain tailors this internal model to the immediate circumstances that you're in. So what's authentic is that you are not one self. You don't have one self, like with a set of essences. You know, you have a set of features that you can use to describe yourself based on the situation that you're in, based on whatever past experiences are most relevant to the situation that you're in. And some features are foregrounded at times, other times they're backgrounded. I mean, basically what's authentic is to think of yourself not as, you know, a static self, which is the same in every context that you're in, but, you know, who you are, how your way of being in the world is largely influenced by where you are and who you're around. And so, and you have a lot of control over your actions in if you understand how that works. So, and by that I don't mean that you have to like put the brakes on, you know, some irrational, you know, response in order to respond more rationally. I mean that, you know, you can choose to put yourself in a context where you can be your best self, be the person that you want to be. Most people can't control everything about their context, but they can control some things. Everybody can control something, you know. So if you don't want to eat potato chips, don't keep them in the house. I mean, like that's the basic message. If you want to be a generous person, create a circumstance for yourself where it's easy for you to be generous, where you can use generous instances from the past to be generous again. And if you don't have that past, cultivate it for yourself. You can't go back into your past and change what's happened, but you can change what you do right now with quite a bit of effort. But that seeds your brain to predict, to kind of like automatically use, what you're doing now. It seeds your brain to do something automatically different in the future. So, I mean, I'm not really sure what your colleague intended, whether, the idea that construction somehow implies that the whole thing is like very artificial. But the fact is, everything you see, everything you hear, everything you feel, everything you smell, everything is constructed. Everything is made up partly. Every experience you have, every action you take is partly, so it's like some combination of what's out there and in here and up here. Always. If what you experience is not partly driven by your internal model, by your past, then you are experientially blind. What you experience is noise.
Yeah. All right. I don't want to take up more of your time. This has been a really great conversation. And I always like talking to you. You are a beautiful writer, and you are performing an important service for everybody. And I personally can't wait for you to come back here and visit in the after times.
In the after times. Yeah.
In the after times.
Well,
right.
It's always wonderful to talk to you, Maryanne. Always,
Yeah.
It's always a pleasure.
Yeah. Thank you.